morning, everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Helene Harrison, and we are going to be talking about Tudor executions. How are you today, Helen?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Very, very interested to talk to you about Tudor executions because it's something that almost makes the Tudor period, and it's something that, whilst it's horrific to have gone and seen, it's kind of thrilling to read about. It's a little bit sad to say that, but it is kind of almost exciting.
Yes, I'd agree. There's a lot going on that's quite interesting to look into. I just can't focus too much on actually how they died, really.
I almost feel really sorry to say that, like, when you read about like the gruesome like beheadings, like even Lady Margaret Pole, who like took so many chops to get her head off, you feel thrilled to read it, but in the same time you're kind of like grossed out. You're like, why am I getting so excited to read about a woman taking so long to have her head chopped off? It is a little bit sad.
Yeah, it is. I think especially a lot of the women, they're either so young or so old that it's quite difficult to research and write about as well.
So that's what we're going to be talking to you about today, is about how the Tudor period is arguably one of the most popular yet fascinating periods in British history. It's either because of Henry VIII's six marriages, his choice to behead two of those wives, or the fact that there was just so much terror and uncertainty that people felt. And it's undeniable that people can connect to that and they love researching it, either one of Henry's wives or all of them. But yet you chose to research the gory and bloody executions of the Tudor period. Can you tell us about why that appealed to you and why you decided you wanted to write a book on it?
Well, my initial introduction to the Tudors was during my A levels when I did a module on Tudor rebellions. Hence, my first book was Elizabethan rebellions. And I then sort of, during my undergraduate degree, my focus was on Anne Boleyn, who obviously was an executed queen, and it sort of went sideways from there. My main interest is still Anne Boleyn, but when I realised sort of Catherine Howard and then Jane Grey had been executed. So it sort of started with the women and then went sideways to the men as well. Sort of my interest in the Howard family, there were a lot of them that ended up executed. And it just sort of grew from there, really. Also, when I was doing some research, I came across a fact that sort of informed the whole book, which is that by the end of the Tudor period, there were no dukes left in England at all. So the last duke was executed in 1572, I think, which was the Duke of Norfolk. And then there wasn't another duke created until 1623 when George Villiers was created Duke of Buckingham. And I just wanted to know, how did this happen? How is it that the highest nobility had just all been wiped out? So that's sort of where the genesis of the book came from, really.
That's actually something interesting that I found when reading a book, is that I didn't know that almost all of the nobility had been taken out. Because if you think about it, Henry VIII had a habit of executing those closest to him, those of the highest power. So it kind of does make you think, doesn't it, of how terrifying it must have been, becoming a duke, or people who were created it going, am I next? And it kind of seems like it from your statement of there was no dukes left at all.
Yeah, it was quite sort of a shocking moment when I realized that. I sort of had to sit back and think, oh, okay, the Tudors have literally wiped out the highest form of nobility during their reigns.
And with your book, which is called Tudor Executions from Nobility to the Block, for those who haven't read it, it features the executions of 14 individuals, which is 9 men and 5 women, where you detail their origins, how they gained fame, or how they rose through nobility, and then their ultimate fall from grace, and how they got on the execution block, because some of them were warranted. Obviously, some, like Anne Boleyn, weren't really warranted, and it was all made up just to please the king, which I think is rather sad, to be honest. I think she could have created so much more for us if she'd stayed alive. And I wanted to know, in what manner did you determine who you were going to focus on? As there was obviously an abundance of executions that occurred within the Tudor era. There's ones from the start of Henry VIII's reign, before he obviously turned into a tyrant, where he thought it was beneficial to have these people executed because they did wrong. And then towards the end of it, he was just executing those left and right, really. You looked at him wrong and you were done for. So what were you looking in these executions? Was it more of the gore and the drama, or was it the complexity of, what led them to the block?
I think for me, it was, well, for a start, I was focusing on the nobility, which immediately narrows the pool down into who you can look at anyway. And then I wanted to cover sort of Anne Boleyn's a sort of watershed moment. I knew she had to be in there, and then Catherine Howard, Jane Grey, obviously regnant queen. I wanted to cover, and I wanted to include Margaret Pole because she's sort of an outlier among the women. She's not a royal woman, but she did have royal blood in that way. It's a bit of a difficult differentiation to make with her. I didn't want it to just be men. I thought it was important to show the breadth of the women as well. And then narrowing down the men was quite difficult. I didn't want to overload it with executions from Henry VIII's reign. So we've got one from Henry VII. He didn't actually execute all that many nobles. He kept them in control through other means. So we only cover the Earl of Warwick from Henry VII's reign. And then even Elizabeth, there's a limited number really of sort of noble executions. I did consider covering the Earl of Northumberland, who was involved in a rebellion and was executed. But yeah, I decided to focus on Norfolk instead in that one because he's the last Duke, so I thought he had to be in there. And the Earl of Essex is the last one I cover, which is it's just such an odd one. I think it's very much an outlier. So I wanted to sort of try and cover the breadth of it and a mix of people who maybe were guilty and weren't guilty. There was a lot of different people that I possibly wanted to cover, but who didn't make it in the end. The Earl of Suffolk, Lord Darcy was a possible as well at one point. So yeah, there are some that fell by the wayside.
And with the number of 14, was that the number that you had originally thought to do? You wanted to do 14 individuals, or was it that you felt like you had to cut down because if you wrote so many, there were just like a cluster of executions, really?
Yeah, I mean, I'd initially sort of narrowed it down to 12, but Jane Grey you can't really discuss without the Duke of Northumberland. Catherine Howard you can't really discuss without Jane Boleyn. And sort of Anne Boleyn and her brother are sort of a natural fit together. So it sort of grew and expanded in different ways. And I did debate, do I combine Thomas and Edward Seymour? But in the end, there was so much on them I had to separate the chapters out. So it sort of evolved almost as I was writing it, really.
Can I ask how long it took for you to research the book and to write it to a place where you felt that you were comfortable with it, where you felt like you had given these people the justice that you felt needed to be given?
Well, I've sort of researched executions for a while. As I sort of read different history books, I'm often taking notes on different things that I think are interesting anyway. So I'd already done a lot of the sort of secondary source research in that way. And with my publisher, we'd sort of set a deadline of when I needed to have the manuscript done by. So I sort of had that to work to. And I just sort of set myself like weekly deadlines of how many words I wanted to write and when I needed to have certain bits of research done by to write those chapters. I don't actually work on it in order either, so it's very in and out depending on what sources I've read and what I feel I need to work on at that moment. So it just sort of evolves as I work on it, really. But I think it was just over a year it took me to write the actual book. But as I said, I'd done most of the secondary source research at that point, and it was just pulling in a lot of the primary source research.
I want to ask about one of my I can't believe I'm actually saying the word favorite because it feels like I'm being rude almost, but one of my favorite to read about, not necessarily favorite for the fact that it happened, executions, which is the notorious one of Mary Queen of Scots by her cousin Elizabeth, which was one of the most important. I mean, it practically like set the end of Elizabeth's reign up and it made it notable for everything that she achieved afterwards. And it was believed that it was done out of either fear from Elizabeth or one of necessity. We are still arguing whether that is necessity or fear. Yet so many historians have argued whether if it was warranted or if it influenced the execution of Mary's grandson, King Charles I, in 1649. And there's been a lot of debate over it. So I guess my question is kind of a two-part question, with the first being, was there a reason that you decided not to feature Mary in the book? Did you feel that perhaps people had featured it before and it wasn't necessary to feature again? You wanted to focus on other people? And then the other part is, do you agree that Mary's execution influenced her grandson's execution?
The reason I didn't include Mary Queen of Scots is actually quite a simple reason, and I think you might be disappointed by it, is that Mary wasn't a Tudor noble. She was a Stuart queen. So for me, that automatically ruled her out because she wasn't a Tudor noble. I'd have to admit I did feel a bit conflicted because I did kind of want to write more about her execution, but I had covered her in quite a lot of detail in my first book as well, on Elizabethan rebellions, which goes past Mary's execution, but she obviously featured as a part of a lot of those rebellions as well. So I did feel like I'd already spent quite a lot of time with Mary, Queen of Scots prior to writing Tudor executions. The second part of your question, I do think Mary's execution did set up Charles's execution. It was the first sort of English execution of a crowned and anointed queen regnant. Obviously, we've got Lady Jane Grey prior to that, but she wasn't crowned. We have Anne Boleyn prior to that, who was crowned but wasn't a regnant queen. So it's all been building up, I think, and I do think it was kind of inevitable that at some point a regnant queen or king would have been executed, because I think there's just been too much terror and fear across the Tudor century, particularly when it comes to the succession. And I think it was bound to happen when it happened. If it hadn't been for Mary Queen of Scots, it might have been later. But I think Mary Queen of Scots set that precedent that was so dangerous during the English Civil War.
And with Mary Stuart, obviously, a lot of people do forget that while she is related to the Tudors by birth, she isn't a Tudor. And I think I kind of remembered that when I was reading the book, because I was kind of like, oh, I wish like Mary had been included. But then I was like, yeah, but she is a Stuart. Even though she had, as she claimed in her life, she did have a claim to the throne because she was related to Tudors. She wasn't a Tudor, she was a Stuart. So even if Elizabeth was like, yes, I'll have you because you're related to by blood, she's not going to let a Stuart sit on the throne, which she did inevitably because she let James
Yes.
sit on the throne.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of connection, and obviously, yeah, Mary does have Tudor blood, but yeah, she is essentially a Stuart, which is why she wasn't included and she did miss the cut on this one.
Sorry, I just had to laugh then because you mentioned cut, and that is actually the basis of the next question. And sorry, that for people who haven't got the gist, she said the word didn't make the cut, and it's about beheading where you cut people's heads off. So that's why I'm laughing for those who didn't get the joke. Despite the popularity of the Tudor executions and the fact that there were so many over the whole of Tudor reign, because we don't just think of Henry VIII as being the sole one who had executions. Henry VII had it, as you said, and then even Elizabeth had them. She had less of them, but she did have them. And it's not commonly known by a lot of people that there were many methods of execution. I think people, when they hear the word execution, they immediately go to either executing by the axe, sometimes by the sword, as we've seen with Anne Boleyn, or they think, they get hanged. And a lot of people don't really see that there was a lot of methods being used. Perhaps not all of them were the best choice with some of them. I think it was Richard Roos was boiled to death. I don't think
Yeah,
that was a particularly good execution. I think I'd rather have my head chopped off.
yeah.
But apart from that, can you tell us a few of the other examples of form of execution that the Tudors actually used that perhaps our listeners might not even know existed?
Yeah, the Richard Roos case is interesting because Henry VIII had actually changed the law to make that the punishment for poisoning, I believe. Richard Roos was supposedly responsible for the attempted poisoning of Bishop Fisher. There were suggestions that possibly Anne Boleyn or her father were behind it at one point. But yeah, Henry VIII changed the law so that boiling was the punishment for poisoning. But there's also the classic hanging, drawn, quartering, which we do see use the Babington plotters in 1586. Anthony Babington was hung, drawn, and quartered. And those executions related to that rebellion were actually over 2 days. And the first day they were hung, drawn, and quartered, but there was such an outcry that the executions scheduled for the following day, they weren't disemboweled until after they were dead. There was such an outcry that Elizabeth changed her mind and commuted those sentences slightly. But we also, as you say, there's execution by the sword as well as the axe. The sword is thought to be a European continental method of execution, which is possibly why Anne Boleyn, having grown up in the Low Countries and in France, it may have been a kind of mercy to her. Of course, Mary I, notorious for burnings. It's interesting because we don't know how many Mary actually executed. Numbers massively seem to vary depending on historian and source. But we know, for instance, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was burnt along with a couple of other bishops. So it did happen. We just aren't sure on the numbers on that one. But there's also, there's a lot of changes in law around execution as well. Acts of attainder started to be used, so there wasn't the necessity for a trial. We see that with Thomas Cromwell, who ironically introduced the Act of Attainder and then was condemned by an Act of Attainder, which is interesting. We also see the law changing again under Henry VIII so that he could execute mad people. We see that in the case of Jane Boleyn. We don't know whether she was mad or faking, but Henry changed the law to make sure he could execute her. So there's a lot of different methods of execution, and there's a lot of changes to the law when it comes to execution as well.
And I just want to focus on the two that you spoke about there, which was the hung, drawn, and quartered, which we do see a lot of, and we even see it in the Tudors as well, perhaps not the most accurately, and about the burning. And I wanted to ask if you could just give us a little bit of an insight into, obviously we know how the burning goes because you just get put on a fire and you're burned. If you could just give us a little insight into what it might have been like. How did the hung, drawn, and quartered go? Were they prepared for it? Did you have to commit a certain crime to be hung, drawn, and quartered? Was there a way for you to get out of it? What can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Well, hung, drawn, and quartered is the traditional punishment for treason. We see Anne Boleyn's male accomplices being sentenced to hanging, drawing, and quartering. But for nobles, that was often commuted to beheading as, a mark of their status. But we also see Mark Smeaton, who was only a musician, having his sentence commuted as well. So it did sometimes happen for more lowly classes. I struggle to imagine what it must have been like to know that that's how you were going to go. You'd be sort of drawn through the streets, usually on a hurdle drawn by a horse, sort of tied down. You'd then be hung until you were nearly dead, but not quite dead, often revived. And then you would see your sort of entrails taken out of your body. Hopefully at some point you would pass out. How often they revived, I'm not sure on. I imagine if they wanted to be particularly cruel, they might revive you. But I would hope you'd be out of it before your head was actually taken off at that point, because I would not even want to imagine how that feels, to be honest. It's pretty brutal. But just also with the burnings, there were occasions where maybe a kindly onlooker might put some gunpowder close so that it could end faster and you wouldn't be screaming in agony for ages and ages.
I believe that happened with Anne Askew, didn't it? She was
That
condemned to be
happens
burned, and she got gunpowder around her neck and things like that.
It's definitely shown in Showtime's The Tudors. I'd need to go back to the sources to see if we actually have any original evidence for that one.
I just can't imagine what it must have been like to know that you were gonna have this kind of death, because it's almost like you've been committed for the crime of treason, whether you're, guilty or innocent, and to know this is kind of like a shameful execution, wasn't it? Because if you think these people's families might have been there, especially if it was a man, his wife might be there, his children, his brothers, they might be there, and they'd have to see this. It must have been like an added horror to the execution. You had to go through it, first of all. You have to pray that you die very quickly, and then you have to know that they're watching you. This is stuff of nightmares almost. I'm so glad we don't do it anymore.
I know, yeah. I can't imagine what it must have been like. And there's a massive psychological effect for the person going through it, the family watching. And I can't imagine what it must have been like for the executioner either, having to sort of do that. And I just think the psychological effects must have been absolutely massive on so many different people having to go through that.
We have obviously a lot of executions happening in the Tudor period, but also overseas as well, because we forget that we're not the only people who execute in the world. And I wondered, because Henry paid for this French executioner, who was obviously an expert, to decapitate Anne Boleyn by the sword, one swift blow, which is obviously what he wanted it over and done with. Was there, with the increase of executions, was it becoming a popular profession? Was it a profession that maybe people felt that it would get a lot of money out of? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know much about. There doesn't seem to be a lot written. There are bits and pieces in a book, I think it's called The History of Treason. It accompanied the National Archives exhibition a few years ago, and that's quite an interesting read. But executioners could be paid quite well. I can't remember how much the Calais swordsman was paid off the top of my head, but I do remember reading a comment. It was quite a lot of money, more than an executioner with an axe in England would usually be paid. But I don't really know much about how popular a profession it was. I've read bits and pieces that say sometimes sort of condemned criminals might be roped in as executioners as part of their sentences. So there's, different sort of ways into it. I imagine not all executioners were criminals, but it has been sort of written about that sometimes that did happen as well.
It must make you wonder what these executioners thought and felt when they were committing. Like, I wonder what the man who executed Anne Boleyn felt like when he went home. I wonder if he went home and saw his wife and children and was just like, I need a moment. Or if like some of these executioners, they knew the people they were executing and almost felt good to be doing it. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think particularly with Anne Boleyn, because there was so much debate afterwards, even, within hours and days of her death, there were people going, hang on, was this actually legitimate at this point? Was she actually guilty? There was a lot of questions asked very early on. That executioner must have been aware of some of the controversy and thinking, oh, what have I done? Like what's happened here? Even if he only asked those questions internally, I think there must have been sort of a lot of questions asked at that point, just because Anne Boleyn's execution was so notorious across the whole of Europe. And we don't even know really who the name of the executioner, or, there's a lot of questions being asked over that. And we don't even have a name. So
I think he's almost. I bet if there's a heaven up there, I bet he's kind of glad there isn't a name. Because imagine going home to France. People knew Anne over there. People liked Anne over there. Imagine going home and be like, "Oh yeah, I was the one that chopped her head off."
hmm.
You might have got a lot of controversy. It's not like with many, many centuries later, we know when Marie Antoinette gets her head chopped off and everyone's happy and they've got like souvenirs and everything like that. Apparently, there's a blood-soaked handkerchief or something like that. I'm so, so glad that none of that happened with Anne. And I think the last question I'm going to ask you, especially with the research and writing process of your book, was there any information or discoveries, perhaps not the word discoveries to use here, there's not much to discover nowadays about the Tudor executions, that perhaps influenced you in writing another novel or perhaps changed your mind about how you perceive an execution?
Well, as you say, there's sort of a limited, probably, amount of new information that's going to come out. I mean, we see obviously Kate McCaffrey working with Anne Boleyn's Book of Hours and things like that. So there are still new discoveries coming out. But yeah, I was just surprised by the fact that there were no dukes left in England by the end of the Tudor period. That just sort of completely surprised me. But I wouldn't say there's anything in this that's really influenced my next book. My next book's been set in stone for quite a long time. It actually comes from my undergraduate and my master's dissertations, which I wrote in 2012 and 2013. And it's called The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, Interpreting Image and Perception. So if you go to my Instagram, which is at TudorBlogger, you can see the cover and the blurb on there now. It's pinned to the top of my profile. But that book, it's been a really, really interesting one, but it's been quite difficult to write because it's sort of a 500 years worth of history looking at different perceptions of Anne Boleyn. So from sort of the love letters and Wyatt's poetry through Shakespeare, through the Victorian sort of revival almost, and then up to sort of modern television film. And we go as far as Six the Musical. So it really is a very wide sort of period to cover in terms of sources. So there's been a lot of binge watching TV and lots of reading of different sort of sources and perceptions and trying to cross check the sources with each other. So do they give differing views, the same views, sort of how it all comes together? So that's been absolutely fascinating to write. And it's the book that right from the start I wanted to write. But when I wrote my first and second, I didn't feel it was quite the right time, that I was quite ready to do it justice. And this one's also my longest book to date as well. It's in the final stages of editing and indexing now, so that's due out in the summer. Hopefully, we're aiming for July, so hopefully it won't be too long until I can reveal more information.
That's such a great title. I'm so sorry. That's just such a great title, especially since like there's a lot of talk over the faces of Anne Boleyn because we see either her being overly sexualized, where we see it in like the Tudors, where we stick with that traditional idea that she was, seducing Henry, she bewitched him and everything, and then we see through perhaps novels or earlier writings where she is sympathized with, where we can see where she did go a little bit against Henry. She didn't ask for this relationship. And in fact, she kind of like
Yeah.
went away from it. So it'll be interesting to see how you put all these sources together because there is quite a lot about Anne Boleyn. I mean, even like I think there was even something like plays or musicals or something in the Tudor era, literally years after her death, where they were almost like these mocking portrayals and things like that. So it'd be quite interesting to see how our perception of her has shifted over the
Yeah.
centuries.
Yeah, it has been really, really interesting. And there were a couple of sources that sort of surprised me a little bit, which was quite nice to sort of find something that maybe I did surprise me. But yeah, we'll see. The title sort of my undergraduate dissertation was actually no, my master's dissertation, sorry, was actually titled The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn. So I have just slightly borrowed my master's dissertation title. But yeah, it was nice going back to that work as well and sort of reading what I'd written then. And a lot of my opinions haven't changed all that much. There's been some slight sort of alterations, but it was nice to go back and see how my style's developed as well.
And it's amazing to think you've been working on this for 15 years, did you say?
Yeah, near enough, yeah.
That is a long time. That's almost
I
like
think I
birthing a
started
baby.
working on my dissertation in 2010, so by the time it comes out, it'll be 15 years, yeah.
That's like almost a whole life of a child almost. That's like adolescenthood and
Yeah.
everything.
So yeah, this is a big one, and I'm quite nervous to see what people think. But
Oh.
yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens when it comes out, I suppose.
I don't think you should be nervous. I think there was a lot of controversy a lot with Anne Boleyn years ago. I think during like the early noughties to the 2010s, there's a lot of drama around it. A lot of people was trying to like argue if Anne was, sexual or wasn't. And I think now a lot of readers are interested in learning the truth and they're not so much forming a bias. We've seen a lot less people going, Anne Boleyn rocks and Jane Seymour's horrible. And it's more like each woman had their faults, each woman had their accomplishments.
Yeah.
One's not better than the other. So I wouldn't worry. I think it's going to be absolutely amazing. And you will be having to send me, I'll be getting a copy and I'll be sending it to you. Like,
Yeah, well, I think Anne Boleyn as well, she's such a polarizing figure that anytime any new work comes out, it's going to produce some kind of controversy. But yeah, this isn't a biography, it's a look at sort of interpretation. So there's room for debate, but I'm just, yeah, hoping we don't get the back to the Anne Boleyn is awful and or Anne Boleyn is great and Jane Seymour is awful. There's that very polarizing thing, which is never really right when you're looking at a living person, because none of us are all good or all bad. So I think, yeah, we need to look at it in shades of grey.
but please continue to bring out so many amazing books because a lot of people, I think, are turning to non-fiction now. They've gone off the fiction and they're turning to books that are going to be able to educate them and they're looking for different opinions because they don't always like reading one type of book. So please continue to bring out some more books.
I've got a few more in the pipeline, yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so, so much, Helen, for joining us today, for talking about these Tudor executions and also a little bit on Anne Boleyn as well. We know we love Anne Boleyn here. So thank you so, so much.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is the ill-fated wives of Henry VIII signing off. Thank you and have a lovely day.